This is Sirens, a new series brought to you by the ladies of Bombshell, where we dissect the institutions of American power. Join us as we sound the alarm on technology, governance, and national security issues, and maybe lure some men to their deaths. I'm Lauren DeYoung-Schulman.
I'm Erin Simpson.
And I'm Radha and Loren.
And as always, we are starting off with our not quite bombshell, but maybe sirens questions. We have a couple new ones to test out this week, starting with, what conspiracy theory do you want to be true? And I'm going to go first because I just want to be super clear that I don't actually want this to be true, but I encountered more people than I ever would have imagined who fully believe that chemtrails are real. Like chemtrails are like a real scary, terrible thing in Silicon Valley. Like, and not amongst.
I thought you were going to say Texas.
No, Silicon Valley. The next door listeners. At first, I thought they were saying, "Hey guys, the like the pest spray people, like the bug spray, mosquito spray people, they're like out, so don't let your kids out." Like, all right, cool. And then I read into the thread, is like, no, these are chemtrail people. They fully believe that like there's airplanes in the sky putting mind control stuff out there. And this was in like Menlo Park. So I don't believe that it's true, but golly, there's a lot of people who do. And I appreciate that for them.
My version, I don't know if this counts as a conspiracy theory, but I'll go with it, which is the Loch Ness Monster.
Mm-hmm.
And here's the thing. Have you ever read the book, The Water Horse?
No.
It's a children's book, and it's basically these kids find a little egg and then hatch it, and then it grows in their bathtub, and then it gets bigger in their bathtub, and then it goes, and it's a frolicking young, wild monster that lives in the nest by them. And in my head, I thought, that'd be fun. Like, it'd be fun to live in a world where you might accidentally find a monster that you raise in your bathtub and then is your secret friend but terrorizes people around your lake. So I'm just saying, the Water Horse.
That could come in helpful.
Nice. Yeah, I could like that. I'm going to go kind of old school, and this is a bit of an homage to my dad. My dad loves Kennedy assassination theories.
Mm-hmm.
Partially it's because my dad worked in trucking, and so my dad loves Teamster/mob conspiracy theories. And so he is deep in the weeds on Kennedy, 5 men from France, some, mob related things from the 1960 election. And I think it very much speaks to the kind of X-Files, 90s elements. I love Cigarette Smoking Man when that was on. And like deeply, you want to believe, right, that there is some like force out there that's actually like driving all of these events. And it's not just that like Lee Harvey Oswald was random and disgruntled and happened to shoot a president and change the course of like 20th century American history, right? So, Kennedy assassination, it'd be nice if there was like some purpose, to that. But I don't think there is.
I keep waiting for like when President Trump threatens to like release classified stuff. I keep waiting for him to release like the good stuff. Like there's got to be good stuff out there, right? Like, come on, man. If we're going to have this in the same presidency, we've got to get something out of this.
I'm with you there. I mean, we'll see kind of where we end up on, what is it, Area 51, Roswell. I mean, I
did Kennedy Files, right?
He did do Kennedy Files. I don't think there's anything in there. Sad.
There's something there,
So he says.
Right, exactly. They kept the good stuff. They always do.
Should have downloaded a sound effect for that.
Dun, dun, dun. Erin, what useless skill are you irrationally proud of?
I'm not sure this qualifies as a useless skill, but it's a non-standard skill that I am very proud of, which is that I'm very good at organizing closets.
Wow.
I can purge a closet. I can organize it. Would you like your shirts by sleeve length and color? Would you like them by season? Is there, some other, how are shoes being done, by heel height, by, occasion? There are lots of opportunities.
Super useful. I don't know why you would call that useful.
Well, I mean, I've done it to your closet, so you would agree that it's useful. What about you, Radha? What's your useless but amazing skill?
Yeah, I was gonna, I would say it's not exactly useless, but I am excellent at like watching any kind of makeup or hair tutorial once and then being able to do it on myself, do it on other people. Like I had a missed career opportunity of being a like hair and makeup stylist, because really, and it is like, it brings me great joy to do when I'm just looking to entertain myself, watching YouTube tutorial on a winged eye or a new approach to contour, some curls, just whatever. Men's hair. I gave my son a mohawk. It's looking pretty good. So anyway.
The other day, I had on some contour makeup, or so I thought. And my beloved husband came up to me. He says, like, "Do you have a bruise on your cheek?" I was like, "Great, this is awesome. I love my life right now." It's like, "No, it's makeup. You know, I'm just gonna wipe it off. It's fine."
I did try fake eyelashes once, like where you put them, and my husband similarly reacted. Was like, "What happened to your eyes?" And like was like looking. I was like, "Okay, well, these aren't the subtle effect I was going for."
Clearly, they're very sexy. My incredibly amazing skill that I'm very proud of is I can create backronyms pretty easily. So a backronym, if you're not familiar, is like you intentionally pick a word and then create an acronym out of that word based on like
Yeah.
whatever program. It happens a lot in congressional bills and also the
Patriot
Pentagon.
Act.
Exactly,
Yeah.
exactly. And so I'm strangely good at this phenomenon. And so if you ever just wake up one day and you need a backronym, give me a call. All
That's
right.
really useful around here, I have to say.
I know. I feel like honestly, between that and if I could be paid to do that and naming tabletop exercises or overseas operations and stuff like that, like that's a good gig, and I would be
I'll do
accepted.
your hair and makeup.
Perfect. Yep. All right. So moving on from our bombshell questions, we move to our first real segment. As a reminder, it's a drill where we go through gossip, current events, where we talk about what's on our mind, what's being discussed at cocktail parties. This week, there's actually, frankly, a lot of gossip going on around about one Elbridge Colby this week. But Erin, what is Mr. Colby? Yeah, Mr. Colby, not Dr. Colby.
Oh, Mr.
Pretty sure.
Yeah.
Pretty sure, Mister. Yeah. Undersecretary Colby. What is he up to this week with regard to weapon shipments?
Politico reported last week, just going into the 4th of July holiday, that Undersecretary for Policy Bridge Colby had announced that he was stopping shipments of key weapons to Ukraine following a review or an assessment of U.S. readiness and weapons stocks. Apparently, these weapons include both drawdown, which comes out of U.S. stocks, but also potentially those weapons that were purchased with Ukraine Security Assistance Initiative funds, USAI funds. So that's kind of interesting to me. The affected weapons would include things like air defense interceptors, Gimlers, and possibly other precision artillery rounds. This has happened before, as folks may recall. There was a pause in January after that terrible meeting between President Trump and President Zelensky. We'll see if this one sticks, because it turns out that this decision and this announcement wasn't coordinated with the State Department or the White House. And in fact, Trump had comments over the 4th of July weekend indicating that he thought transfers were still happening and was supportive of said transfers. And further, there was a leak that the Joint Staff assessment, or the Joint Staff disagrees with policy's assessment, or at least Bridge Colby's assessment, with regard to readiness. So a couple of interesting things here with regard to how long or how will this policy actually play out over time. And two, literally any concept of a process by which these things get both decided and announced.
But do you think that they just didn't want to call Marco Rubio, and that's why both state and NSC didn't know? It's like a one-stop shop, and they're just like, meh.
I mean, or they did, and he didn't call them back. I mean,
It's also possible because he has 7 jobs, so he's busy.
So,
The other thing about this is that there's 2 layers of anger making that Bridge Colby did here. And the first is making the decision in the absence of a process, which sometimes people are less angry about than the second, which is having other people talk about your policy in an inaccurate way. That makes people really mad when they end up say something in public that is no longer true or that is apparently false in some regard. People really, really get angry about that kind of stuff. And I'll just be curious to see if they end up changing their mind on the policy or if they just get mad at Colby because he didn't actually tell them what was up.
Well, I'll also say that, consistent with some of our previous discussion in this vein, the Pentagon is leaking like a sieve right now.
Yes.
I mean, you can get it from the Joint Staff, you can get it from the services, you can, phone out to the COCOMs and get it from folks there, because there's not a process and people maybe aren't feeling like they're being heard internally. It seems to me that they are very happy to dish externally on, what's going on and why they don't like it.
Yes, but also external in a way that isn't traditionally true in national security decision. External perceptions and news coverage drive senior decisions. So I think there is
They're playing
So
to an
I
external
would say it's
audience.
an end run around the process, except there's no process to end run, but it's an end run around the chain, I guess, the decision making chain.
Or it's a VFR direct decision chain. They just want to get
Yeah.
it on Fox, and then they
Yeah.
have the White House decision that they want without having to go call Marco Rubio.
Yeah. Oh, that's a great point. Fascinating. Uh, in a very sort of different style of what's going on in DC right now. So the Social Security Administration, it is one of many agencies that does a whole lot of like customer service style, service style activities with the American people, and that involves you applying for coverage of various things. It may involve you calling them and saying I need help with something. It may involve saying that like I didn't get my benefits on time. It's a lot of 24-hour support that they have, whether that be in offices or at a contact number or online. And because it's public, they have traditionally shared a lot of metrics around here's how long it takes to actually do stuff. And it used to be pretty scandalous because you would be waiting on hold for hours and hours at a time in order to just get basic information about your account or otherwise. And some of the slowest things that they have done over time is do process applications for disability benefits and also adjudicate those after they inevitably have messed them up in some way. So what they've done now, they've taken what used to be almost 3 dozen sets of performance metrics around like how well they are doing, and they're actually making some improvements in the past couple of years to change them into a much more generic, hey, it seems like things could be faster if you did things online, which is often a kind of nudge around we don't actually want you to call us, we don't want you to show up in person, we want you to try to do this online, which is maybe okay if you're talking about Amazon, but is actually not okay if you're talking about the United States because a lot of one, you have to serve everybody. There's not an option. You can't just be like, actually, I only prefer to serve people who do stuff online. And two, a lot of the stuff is not actually accessible online anymore because of the kinds of things that people often need the most help with. So by taking this data offline, they've now made it harder for themselves to be held accountable. And they're also encouraging people to do things that are simply no longer possible for them on an online basis.
Yeah, and just as we were talking about this, I was looking up just to remind myself, like, there are a lot of beneficiaries for this. Like, you forget at how it's like 70 million people. The flow of new beneficiaries is like 5 to 6 million people a year, right? Like, it's a lot of people that are being served. And if you thought about that in the commercial context, like, you would definitely have customer service numbers that like your board of director and or major shareholders would want to assess you against to make sure you're sort of delivering on like product solutions and whatnot. So the idea that the version of that for the federal government is like just get slid under a sheet of paper is troubling to say the least.
Yeah, this is also after they spammed everybody after the one big
Right.
beautiful bill was passed last week. Say like, hey, here's your benefits no longer are taxable, which is not actually true. And I actually passed it around and say like, is this actually from Social Security? This is crazy.
Yeah. There has certainly been a lot of strong feelings and reactions to things happening on the Hill. In sort of a slightly different topic, but related to kind of this notion of government functioning and government accountability, there was a pretty strong reaction to former Secretary Lloyd Austin sort of leading a new consulting company effort. Senator Warren and a Republican senator, Rick Scott, I think, joined together in a letter saying that they were concerned about this and, concerned about the so-called revolving door problem. And there has been, just to be clear, a host of articles and frankly hand-wringing about this. I'll just show my cards a little on how I feel about it. Over time, and certainly during the Biden administration, on sort of what types of jobs are appropriate and acceptable for former government officials to hold after they leave government. And implicit in that is what kind of jobs can you hold if you're a mid-career person and wish to come back into government that won't be held against you. And a lot of this centers around this notion of the revolving door, which often gets kind of overlapped with this question of conflict of interest. And so, there was a letter to Secretary Austin, a response from Secretary Austin saying that he would, abide by the recusals he had. This is extra interesting because actually in the Biden administration, there was an extra, as I like to call it, unemployment pledge to not do certain kinds of activities after the administration was done through executive order from President Biden at the time that was rescinded by the Trump administration when they came in, which shortened those timelines for some things. These are not exactly apples to apples, but for ease, shorten the timelines for that. In parallel, in the past, Senator Warren has had a number of proposals to lengthen those timelines to go from 1 to 2 to 4 years for certain kinds of activities. Historically, this is centered around lobbying. The way to get around that is this sort of consulting and advising loophole, which means you can advise the company, but you can't directly represent back to the government. I use loophole in air quotes, which you obviously can't see in a podcast because it is literally a difference because you're not going in person, but advising a company. But anyway, I'll just kind of stop this rant with I think the conversation in part gets really muddled because it conflates a bunch of different things. One is conflict of interest, which is when you're in government, you have an interest in giving preferential treatment to some companies or certain sectors or whatever based on your role. The second is sort of regulatory capture, where agencies are unduly influenced by the industries they influence. So that's really common in the defense sector. And I feel like the defense industry is driving the acquisition policy rather than the other way around. And the third is commitments made by nominees and senior officials when they're going into government and how that relates to their activities afterwards. So there's a lot of, I think, once again, hammering on it, I feel it's a little bit like rearranging deck chairs on the Titanic, given everything else that's happening in the government, but still something that is obviously subject of some chat.
Lauren, I know you have strong feelings on this as well.
I do. So I just feel like Democrats in particular tend to tie themselves up in knots over this kind of stuff. And it would be a lot simpler if we just recognize that the real problems tend to come while people are actually serving in government, and to actually focus our time on what is it they are doing while they are in government, as opposed to what thoughts they had ahead of time and what actions they may take afterward. So that's one big thought I have. The second is, frankly, we need to stop pretending as though we are somehow because of the sorts of jobs that we are willing to take, we're somehow better or worse than anybody else in the world. Democrats take lots of jobs in lots of different industries, and they do great work in them. And the fact that there's often this attempt to say that, because we're not recruiting from industry, or we didn't recruit from Google, or we didn't recruit lobbyists, except for the several times that we did all of those things in prior administrations. There's hypocrisy and double-sidedness here. There's challenges with what people are committing to in order to get confirmed. There's challenges to the fact that after the fact, who cares what people do in a lot of different cases. And there's also the issue that Radha has said many times: what kind of jobs are people allowed to have, particularly as a mid-career person? There's just not that many places where people are allowed to go and work. So I would prefer a system where we focus much more about behavior in government and stop pretending as though we were some special, extremely ethical party that didn't pursue jobs in places that made people possibly mildly offended in some way. And I know that's not something that's going to be acceptable to Senator Warren, but I also feel like we would be better off in terms of actual ethical process if we focus much more on true conflict of interest while people are making real decisions in government.
And it would let us get some of the talent we need in, right? Because if you think that there are whole sectors that are driven by expertise that come in, that you get from industry, and then saying that industry expertise inherently, either before or after, inherently generates conflict of interest, it's just it's hard to square that circle. So I totally agree. I think to the extent we can really narrow down what is the conflict of interest we're trying to mitigate, what is it, who has it, and then how do we appropriately mitigate or provide checks on it, that would feel much more both reasonable and accessible than this much more amorphous. You can't do X, Y, or Z. We're not going to tell you exactly what X, Y, or Z are, but they're all of the things that would allow you to support your family and or develop additional expertise in the periods when you're not in government.
On top of which, we have all three been in government now. Our ethics attorneys work so hard, but they have such a huge realm of things that they're meant to oversee that their advice is often less around like, here's the actual advice I can give you on choices you should make and how to actually advise you on really hard things, and more, yeah, that's kind of unexplored. And here's a lot of options that you have. And I can't really tell you what to do. Like, okay, it's not always the most useful thing. So, anyway, someday we will be able to upgrade these systems into something that's slightly more rational and also better for human capital. With that, let's move into an actual dumpster fire instead of just a potential one. Dumpster fires are, as a reminder, so are bigger stories, bigger things that we want to chat about that are potentially impacting institutions and that underpin American power. Long-term things, there's stuff that may be getting lost in the noise. The first one that we want to talk about, it's not getting lost in the noise this week, because there's been lots of elegies and obituaries and many things to the U.S. Agency for International Development, which officially closed its doors on July 1st. And this is interesting because I think that this has been a long time coming, at least in the Trump administration, in terms of their slow and then rapid shutdown of some programs, removal of personnel. But we've all had throughout our conversations on Bombshell and otherwise lots of thoughts around the efficacy of U.S. development dollars and USAID as a program overall. So I'd love to dig into this. So just some background really quick. See, the agency as a whole, on average, puts out about between 50 to 75 billion a year in terms of assistance to other countries. The US government is the single largest aid donor in the world, probably no surprise based on that number, but it's still, no matter what people tend to think of it, a much, much smaller percent of the federal budget than people might expect, closer to around like a little over 1%, rather than the enormous percentages that people often expect. With the shutdown of the agency over the last few months, close to 95% of the 13,000 personnel that they have been laid off, with a few of the rest absorbed into the State Department. And something like 85% of the programs that they oversaw, on anything from HIV to disaster relief to promoting democracy and many others, have been fully shut down overall. And the actual long-term planning for those is pretty unknown. So I think that, like, this is not only a question around the is this actually problematic, bad, risky, or terrible that the agency has been shut down, and what happens to the aid, but also the precedent it sets around a president unilaterally shutting down an agency and also previously authorized aid programs. So I actually just start with that. That with the billions of dollars that have been shut down, the staff that have been removed, can a president actually do that? And whether or not he can or not, is that a problem that we have done so?
So I will say the Trump administration has clearly been testing the limits of appropriation norms, which is to say we have an appropriation process by which, the president submits a budget, the Congress then debates and approves a budget. Congress holds the purse strings. They give it to the executive branch, and now the executive branch is expected to execute that. Now, there has some precedent. I'm not a lawyer. I'm not going to pretend to be one, but of when the executive branch can decline to execute appropriated dollars, which has largely been seen as not a thing executives can do, but is not fully a fully resolved legal issue. Point one. And point two, the extent to which you can reimagine or reinterpret how appropriated dollars are done, either through sort of doing things in broader strokes that are broadly consistent, or doing formal reprogramming and moving dollars between different programmed items, is also a series of norms. So I think the long and short answer is the president can do it if Congress cedes its Title I authorities to oversee appropriations, right? And I say that like it sounds more glib than I mean it, right? Look, if I have delegated my authority to someone and they now execute it, that is not that authority doesn't exist. What I think is particularly problematic here is that it's not an explicit delegation. There are authorities that Congress holds, like tariffs, as an example, which they have delegated to the executive branch to do at certain conditions. That explicit change hasn't happened here, so that's a difference. But if Congress decides it has delegated this to the president, then I suppose he can do it pending our third branch of government disagreeing.
Yeah,
Well, I
I
mean,
think that
but even a different point is, wasn't USAID created by statute? I mean, there's the one thing about how the money slides and moves around, and frankly, there's a lot of ins and outs to that. Oh, I'm so sorry I didn't get that money on contract before the fiscal year ended. Oh, whatever shall I do? Not typically encouraged, certainly not usually directed by the executive branch, but to completely disestablish a federal agency,
yep.
with no input from the Congress. Just, clearly he can do it because he did it, right? So there's a version of that, but he did it because Congress was either too cowed or too supportive in some other fashion, to want to stick up for their own prerogatives. And obviously, we're seeing this across a litany of issues.
And this to me is one of the really interesting pieces around all the appropriations litigation that is going on at this moment, where the narrow places where the litigation is happening, where like somebody is found to have been harmed in some way, there's a litigant that that sues the government because they are ostensibly being harmed in some way. um it is often somewhat dissociated from the political context and policy context that we're talking about, or to the degree that it's not, it's a really, really, really narrow soda straw, and that people are trying to solve a legal problem, which is different in some ways from this bigger question around like, wow, the president just shut down a statutory agency, which is also a legal problem, but it's also a political problem in the sense of now have precedent for that, and we now have precedent for Congress being pretty quiet about it. So before we actually talk about our views on the efficacy of this agency, like, is there just Radha, you made this point around like they're testing the waters here. What further waters do you think that they imagine they might explore, or is that kind of unknown?
I mean, I like everything is unknown right now, so I suppose I fall unknown category. But I guess to sort of build on Erin's point, the statutory existence of USAID is problematic in in a distinct way from the appropriations piece. To the extent you dual hat someone and say, like, this person, I think it's Marco Rubio, right, is the USAID director.
He is,
Like,
actually. You're right.
what does it mean? Marco Rubio, give us a call. What does it mean to have an agency that exists, right? If you have a Senate confirmed official, like imagine it wasn't Marco Rubio, but another Senate confirmed official, and you had an agency head that existed in name only, and all of their funds had been appropriated away. Does that agency exist? It's like Schrodinger's agency, I guess.
Schrodinger's agency.
So I think there's a piece there that's a little bit of a shell game, right? If you keep someone as dual-hatted with it, I think the real question would be like, what about agencies that have that their statutory functions are not just that? Like, can you just establish DOJ? Could you disestablish the Department?
They'd like to do it to Department of Education.
Yeah,
right. Can you do it to the Department of Ed? Like, so you start getting into these.
But can we pick some better ones? Like, could they do it to MDA?
What about the Army?
Right. I mean, if we think we care about precedent,
could you make the Space Force its own military department? Like, oh, surely. Could you do it by fiat without legislation? Like that. Like that's the question, right? Like, because it's this creative destruction question of the construction of the executive branch, and does that construction actually exist in a statutory sense, or with the advice and consent of Congress or the Senate, or however you're doing it?
It really would be interesting to try to find the limit. Like, what is the thing that the Congress actually cares about in terms of their own prerogative? Like, with the people who've been total nitnoids about the NDAA for the last 15 years, like actually hold the line in some fashion on this? Or
if they disestablished the Army, like you would get some congressional call outs.
Maybe.
I don't know.
But they clearly didn't go after USAID by accident. Like they targeted them in Project 2025, but also Democrats themselves have come out and publicly said, "Hey guys, let's not be too crazy about defending USAID, because I don't really know what Americans think about this," which is totally true in terms of public sentiment. But like, with that in mind, like, was there some mild justification here in terms of going after USAID?
Well, I mean, I think the correct way to have done it, if you really were concerned about it, would have been to, reset the budget lines and actually have the fight on the appropriations. I mean, I've been a longstanding aid critic. I used to do contract work for USAID. Radha and I both encountered them in Afghanistan. I think certainly for folks who, in particular, work with USAID in conflict settings, that is a small portion of the agency, but also one that was like very fraught, right? Like very, very difficult to like have conversations around. That dumping $1 billion a year into Afghanistan is like mostly like ending up in bank accounts in Dubai, either through Taliban or from straight from national coffers and Kabul bank sorts of things. So there's was definitely an element of I don't know. There was a very specific worldview at USAID that was hard to kind of dislodge, even when us as researchers or analysts really felt that there were things different going on. That's different than their global health and a lot of their
Yeah.
institution building and
Yeah.
other sorts of things that they did in other parts of the world.
So I have basically two thoughts on this that could probably apply to a range of other things that have happened since the Trump administration took over. One is I have somebody quipped to me once that this basically has all the wrong answers to all the right problems. And I think that's it, right? Like, look, there's a kernel here of like, was USAID super well run? Did they have some bloat and some, frankly, mission creep that they weren't super effective at? Absolutely. And that leads me to my second point, which is like, instead of a chainsaw, we really needed at least a carving knife, if not a scalpel, right? Like, I'm not saying you need to go all the way to scalpel, but like, you need you need something with a little bit more agility and movement. And I think the problem here is these blunt solutions really throw the baby out with the bathwater. I'll just mix as many analogies as I can in this answer. Throw the baby out with bathwater. And so, yes, like, look, do I think a range of the democracy, governance, civil society building work, especially in places like Afghanistan, were ineffective and probably both ineffective in application and poorly run? Yes. Do I think that we should thus cut critical nutritional needs for infants facing droughts and stop the treatment that prevents HIV from becoming AIDS and save millions of lives and prevented a future pandemic? No, right? Like, I can hold both of those beliefs in my head at the same time. And I think the problem is that we've treated USAID covering all of that without both of that.
Yeah. Yeah. I think something that, just to close this out, I foresee the Trump administration starting to miss some of this funding and some of these programs in a number of different ways. But one of the big ones is after or during, like in the midst of or after, immediately after a disaster, people start looking for what are ways for the United States to be able to show up in the press in a positive way. And you can do that to some degree with military, but not very effectively. And the Department of Defense will say that themselves. The places where you go for those sorts of resources are places like USAID. And then similarly, there's been some programs that have been or shut down and turned back on again, but we got a fair amount of political criticism for them. So I think members of Congress in particular like being able to have access to this for a number of different reasons. And we will start to see some drift back into some of these programs being turned back on, not effective, not as they were before, but I think slowly over time, which is not ideal, but it's certainly happening.
And I'll use this as a sort of pivot point to the next topic. But the thing we haven't discussed, but is worth just remembering, is this is also just a boon to China. Like, yes,
Yep.
This is not part of the domestic sentiment piece, but like a way the U.S. proves its, I'll call it value proposition. The case for the U.S. in many places comes from the kinds of investments we can make with USAID. Not everywhere. There are certainly criticisms of it, but to completely cede that territory feels ill-advised if we want to have an all-sector competition with China, which leads me to a similar sort of direction, which is, we've talked about the international competition for AI talent and the role that things like immigration policy have played in that. And now we're seeing even within the US, that type of competition for talent really heating up. So just by way of context, there were a couple of stories in the last week. last week, maybe the last 10 days, on the poaching of tech talent between essentially a small number of companies. So between like Meta, formerly Facebook, OpenAI. If you go back just a little bit in time, Grok slash XAI, and Google DeepMind, right? Like, so there is a small number of companies that are doing these sort of really frontier AI model work. And there are a small number of people who do that work in those companies. And so there's been just a huge amount of interest in the poaching and the large salaries of those individuals. Just for additional context, I'll say I think it's interesting that it's happening literally in the same 2-week period where leaders from those companies are going out and saying things like expect large scale layoffs. This is the end of software engineering and coding as we know it. I expect 50% of jobs to be replaced by AI in the next decade, right? Like not even decade, I think next 5 years, right? So really expansive concerns about this, all are in a variety of sectors, but largely concentrated in this software engineering and tech sector. So I think it's kind of helpful to take a moment to just think about like, hey, what's going on here? And what do we think about it? And maybe we can start by just thinking about like what is going on. It wasn't so many years ago where these types of tech jobs, especially in the pandemic, were super high in demand and were needed. And so it's kind of helpful to start there. And maybe I'll think about like what types of talent are needed in this, I don't know, post AI transformation or in the world leading up to and then post the AI transformation that apparently is coming imminently.
Well, I mean, none of us are software engineers, at least the last that I checked. So I think and there's certainly been, I think, but we do know quite a few of them, or have worked with them alongside them. It's pretty clear to me that there's both, I don't say a mixed reaction, but there are definitely folks who, code in one way or another for a living, who really enjoy working with AI tools, like as part of their coding process. Not fully outsourcing it, but they think that it really does help like level up. Now, I think there's an interesting question what that means for kind of new generation of coding talent. And can you learn to code well enough and to code elegantly, with if you kind of grow up with AI tools, will the AIs themselves get good enough at these things that they really can code on their own? Those are all open questions. But I don't get my sense is not is that the people who are getting poached, and we're talking like tens of millions, hundreds of millions of dollars being thrown at this, double digit number of individuals probably, but like they're not being hired because they're coders would be my guess. So what is it that, are they vision people? Are they architects? Are they really good at programming GPUs in some way? Are they doing like data architecture, sorts of things in terms of how you design data centers? Like that strikes me as like a different skill set and one that probably won't be dislodged by AI, in the near term, but also like all these professions exist to create walls to make sure that like other people can't, encroach, into their highly skilled, highly paid spaces.
Yeah, I think something I think the analogy works here. So, like, we're talking about individuals who are themselves incredibly talented, the folks who are being poached from place to place. And I have a few thoughts on it. Like, one is they are, as your point, Aaron, like they're not there as like silos of talent unto themselves. They are likely, I presume, there as people who are able to be the anchor who can set up either officially set up a strategy or help drive a strategy in some way that starts to create a flywheel around what other kinds of roles and talent and layers and programs and outputs and other things that they need. They're not just like themselves the genius who sits locked in a room, though maybe they are. But with that comes a lot of other expectations for different kinds of talent and the ability to interact with such talent, whether that be lawyers or auditors or social scientists or any number of other things. The other thing that struck me in looking at like the people being poached with some regularity from company to company for gajillions of dollars is that it creates an interesting market around like not just how much money you're trying to seek, but the kind of place and the roles that you want them to have. Of like where and are then software engineers or whomever or machine learning experts, others, are they able to set standards based on the talent market of talent? The top talent won't go work for company Y because they are not making these commitments, but lower level talent will, but only if you pay them X million dollars at a time. And that creates interesting implications in terms of like what companies actually end up doing at the end of the day.
Yeah, I mean, I'm really struck by the journey we're on that in some sense is really repeating some of what we saw in the journey in social media companies where like first came the software engineers, first came the machine learning engineers in this case, right? Who figured out new and clever ways to sort of train and have models do inference in combining data in ways that we never thought were possible. That's the AI analogy to the social media sort of network connections that you saw in the early days of social media. But then all of a sudden they're like, oh, there are like social dynamics and legal issues. And also we need our users to use this. And so then there was this real push to recruit experts in these areas. And again, you can see this in waves, right? There was the big data wave when we had data, and then there was like data scientists and analysts they were like, oh, you can't just have data, you need to have some social science in there. Then there was the social media wave, and you need to have other people who know both think about users and think about social dynamics. And now there's an AI wave. And I just wonder in some senses, as we broaden the aperture, what we think about, okay, right now we're in the 12 people who know how to do unsupervised learning innovation. Like, great. Like 12 to 24 months from now, what is the next tranche of things we really think are going to be the in-demand skills? And how does that, I don't know, how does that relate to what we saw before, especially in the era where I'll share my bias of where we suddenly realized social science was relevant to, data and insight.
I mean, I hope they realize that business cases are relevant. Like, I mean, that's my pithy answer. Like, they should hire somebody who knows how to make some money off this stuff.
Yeah.
Because I'm still not sure, like, how we're productizing, other than like Microsoft, shoving, new AI tools down people's throats in Microsoft Office. But that's not making people buy more Office, right? At least that's my understanding. So I think that there's, at least in this kind of public technology company space, a lot of work still to do on, how we actually create products that can make people money that people want to buy, as opposed to things that people are forced to use as part of a broader enshittification of the internet.
They have there's this Instagram account I follow that's like personifying agentic AI. And it's like, what if Microsoft Excel was just like a coworker? And they have a dude like doing a formula there. I got a formula for you. And that's kind of my mental model right now as you talked about.
I mean, it's also my favorite Venn diagram, which has Excel and Incel, and in the middle overlap, it says, "Is this a date?" And like, it's just too good. It's just too good.
Well, maybe I'll close this out by, bringing it back to sort of, in some senses, near and dear to our hearts, which is like, if we want the US to lead in AI, which I do at least right now, I'll put that caveat in there. And we think that, the key people who are going to do this are going to cost tens of millions of dollars and are going to work for one of three companies. What does that mean for whether the US government can ever, are we going to have to rely on the future Elon Musk to come in and doge the US government to get AI? Like, how do we think about the context of talent in the US government and keeping pace there?
Yeah, I think that there's not a good or easy answer to it, but I think that lots of people want to say that it's all about salary and like you can't hire folks that are talented on these sorts of salaries. And that has a bit of a grain of truth, but not nearly as much as people think it does, particularly if you are managing talent in a useful way. But to be clear, we should be talking about the full spectrum here. You need people who understand the highest level potential and risk of artificial intelligence, of which you need probably a few of those. They don't necessarily need to be machine learning experts themselves, but they need people who understand what that means, who are helping write laws, set up policy, develop relationships, and so on. And then you need all the way in the other spectrum, like you need people who can actually help organize, manage, and make best use of the data that US government has. And that may be people who are skilled, but far less skilled than the people getting paid $300 million a year from the various companies in some ways. Some of that's going to come from upskilling existing people that we have. Some of that's going to come from training people who have human capital, financial management, or legal roles into like, this is what this means and how you make best use of it. And some of it's going to be in creating creative relationships where you have folks come in for like a couple years at a time and then go out and solve other hard problems. I think the biggest thing that's the biggest attractor for federal hiring is we work on really cool stuff, but for a limited period of time, and then you're going to get frustrated. So to be able to absorb that cool stuff, frustration, boot you out, come back in again model is something that we're not terribly good at, but could get a lot better at if we put our minds to it.
Well, and I think, my pithy answer to this, which I think we probably talked about on a Bombshell episode once upon a time, is also change federal drug policy. I mean, tech talent among others, but and we're actually moving down this space since we first talked about this several years ago, which
Yeah.
is removing marijuana from the whichever controlled substance schedule that it's on. As that works its way through both clearance application issues, drug-free workforce, issues, and the like. I mean, I think that there are a number of things that create barriers to federal employment, not least of which is the current environment where people are getting fired summarily. But I do think that you can make federal work, really attractive to folks. Especially if you can do it in places that aren't on the coasts, right? You have the ability to create a new Silicon Valley in some places, through creation of data centers or other that sort of reinforcing geographic effect. The federal government is actually quite good at that when it wants to be. It's
Yep.
not perfect. The GeoInt Center in St. Louis is, kind of struggling along, but I think there are some opportunities there. But this is also, I mean, I don't think the private sector is going to be able to sustain this for very long either, right?
Yeah.
So this is a very splashy sort of, for lack of a better term, dick waving contest between the really big, companies, and they are having, just as they are in their other product lines, having to come to terms with what's the business case, what's the actual talent that is necessary to run the things that make the money, and then that maybe there's some room for some splashy stuff on top, and run a A's hire A's, B's hire C's, sort of paradigm. But this is not sustainable, even in the world of venture capital money for very long.
All right, last substantive segment before we get into the Gong Show. Warning signs, where we chat with one of us about one big issue. In the future, we may include some interviewees in this space, but for now, you just get to enjoy our delightful voices. Wanted to talk about something that's been on our mind for several weeks now, and that is what we should read into the series of protests that have gone on both against the Trump administration overall, but also some of the very specific Trump administration actions since the beginning of the administration. And there have been several huge ones over the last several weeks. And it's just like, as somebody who is sort of a very, very, very amateur person, not quite political scientist, but political science major. So definitely not political scientist. I'm very curious about like, what does this actually mean and matter? Like, what should we be reading into this in terms of signals? So I'll actually just turn it over to Erin in terms of kind of first body of conversation, like in terms of the sorts of protests that have gone on over the last few months. Are there standouts? Like, are these big numbers of participants, notable organizers, notable themes behind this that should stand out to us in terms of what this means?
Sure. I mean, I think there's a few different ways of looking at this, and there's probably only a half dozen or so listeners who know that this is in many ways the set of topics that I originally cut my teeth on as a political scientist. So I took a class at the University of Kansas called Protest and Repression in probably 1998. And then that's really what set me off wanting to study civil wars, understand when protests become violent, and that ultimately led to insurgencies, which then led to counterinsurgencies. So, mamas, be careful what your kids take in their undergraduate coursework. So, certainly from the last few weeks, and even probably the last 6 months, the big focus has been on a series of protests. Now, I think largely called No Kings protests, but they've had a few different type names. There was a very large one in June, and the emphasis there was really on the sort of nationwide turnout, which is about 5 million people. By contrast, the Women's March in 2017, which was also a large nationwide protest just a week after inauguration, actually, was about 4 million people. And in terms of kind of overall percent of the population, those each come out to between 1% and 1.5% of the total population, depending on how you look at it. So those are substantial numbers. Like that is a large single day protest for the United States.
On the topic of percentages, I there are times when I'm searching through Blue Sky and I feel like somebody else is speaking another language because there seems to be some conventional wisdom around 3.5% protesting, or 3.5% of the population protesting means something in terms of the size of the protest, the effectiveness of protest. Like this is a signal of some kind. What should we be reading into that?
So that's built on research by Erica Chenoweth and her various co-authors, based on a study basically that she did, where she looked at a series of nonviolent protest events from 1900 originally to 2006. Calculated, relied on reporting to identify the sort of largest protest, in each of those, kind of the maximal event, and then divided that by the country's population at the end of the calendar year at which the event took place. As she was looking through all of those, there were only a handful of protest events that got over 2% of the country's population. There's something like maybe 25 to 30 in that category. And then of protests where over 3.5% of the population turned out, literally all of those protests achieved their aims. Now, what were their aims? Those were all sort of mass mobilization, political protests against a regime or against a particular political leader. So you think about people power in the Philippines in the 1980s. You might think about Eastern Europe. You might think in the Velvet Revolution, among others. You might think about the protests against Chilean or Argentinian juntas in South America, even the First Intifada or the Iranian Revolution. These are the kinds of things that she's looking at there. And so if you get to the point where 3.5% of the population shows up on a public mass protest, that then has a very strong correlation with basically leading to regime change or the ouster of the incumbent political official.
So this leads to my next question, which I recognize is both ridiculous, but it's a real one. Like, what is if you are setting out a goal to have a mass nationwide protest and you think that it's actually plausible that you're going to be able to pull this off over a weekend or a period of time, what is actually a reasonable spectrum of goals to be able to pull off? Is it just attention? Is it regime change? Like, what is if you are an organizer, like what's a reasonable set of expectations you be able to think through? Or is that even like a question worth asking?
It's a question political scientists have difficulty answering. I can tell you that. In the context of the work by Erica Chenoweth and others, those the hitting 3.5% was not the point, was not the purpose, right? It was incidental on the way, in pursuit of the overall goal. And so in some ways, that mass political, the public presentation of that is kind of an iceberg type effect, right? The visible portion is just what's above the surface, right? There's a lot going on underneath. And it's that if you're doing all of those things underneath, you'll then be able to generate that 3.5% potentially above the surface. For other protest movements, which frankly are more similar to what we've seen in the United States, those tend to be issue oriented. So you think about, anything from, union and labor organizing in the early 20th century to the suffrage movement. Obviously, the civil rights movement is kind of the most canonical in the US context, but you also have anti-apartheid, Black Lives Matter, Occupy Wall Street. And so each of these things, at least the way that I used to try to think about them, there's both a spectrum, or as the literature calls it, a repertoire of protest. Mass public protest is only one element of what you might do. You might engage in a boycott, right? You might engage in other nonviolent direct action in order to cause pain or create costs for incumbent leaders, or to get people in the middle to choose a side one way or another. That's going to line up differently depending on the nature of your goals, right? It's like not every topic or every policy preference needs mass activity, right? If it's something that Congress very specifically can take action on, or a regulatory agency, right? That's a different sort of influence strategy than we wish to create larger scale costs or create costs such that we get larger scale attention to a particular set of challenges.
I got one last question that I would actually, both of you may have some thoughts on. And that is, we are operating right now in a world of social media where, at a very superficial level, sometimes it seems as though what's necessary to generate or organize a protest is just to post something on Blue Sky or Twitter or Facebook and do it enough times that enough people show up. But there's, as you were alluding to, Erin, there's just so much below the surface in terms of the organizing that goes on, even with a you're just showing up to protest something sort of protest. Is there like the other kind of either historical analogies or the other background that listeners should be thinking about in terms of it's not just that social media hit and people showing up in person. There's more, significantly more that goes on below that.
Yeah, and I was reminded of this because I remember both participating in some of these debates on Twitter around the Arab Springs, like in 2011. But there was a debate between, God of all people, Malcolm Gladwell and Clay Shirky over
Wow.
right Wayback Machine,
Hashtag right
um,
there.
and really around the degree to which we were seeing novel, activity purely through social media or largely social media, or the extent to which social media was sort of being layered on top of much more traditional organizing, which was Gladwell's argument. Woe be it for me to support or defend Malcolm Gladwell, but it turns out in this instance, I think he was very much right. And he highlighted work by Doug McAdam, who had done a lot of research on the American Civil Rights Movement and ended up writing kind of one of the canonical texts with Charles Tilley and Sidney Tarrow on kind of how we think about contentious action and protest, which is that strong ties matter. Strong ties meaning somebody that you have like an in-person connection to. And I think the way that I would think about it is if what you're asking people to do is to show up on a Saturday and you've created an environment that's meant to be quite permissive, it's meant to be family friendly, it's meant to be sort of celebratory of popular participation, you probably don't need a lot of strong ties to do that. You're going to need strong ties to get huge numbers because people actually organize through schools and churches and other civic organizations. But you could do a lot of social media or even just public media to get people to the time and place of a baseline protest. If you want people to pay costs, either through a boycott, a strike where they're not working and they might have effect on their wages, where there's a risk of arrest, they're choosing to engage in civil disobedience, more like the lunch encounter protests, where you go in deliberately knowing and in fact choosing to be arrested in that instance. Or of course, even more serious, both bodily harm, either at the protest itself or potentially, if you think about other action of Freedom Summer, registering voters in a way that is very likely to lead to interpersonal violence. I think those sorts of things where the costs are quite concrete and knowable in advance require strong ties. I think if you're trying to get people to do something that they perceive as dangerous or potentially harmful to themselves or their family, they need to have a really good reason to do it. And that means that you're actually like trading on trust in community, and more of that than just a social media post and social media campaign to initiate that action.
Yeah, and not to be the heartless economist of our group, but here we are. We all play our roles. In the post-social media age, and something I've been just increasingly reading about is you can also get people to pay costs through marketing and propaganda, right? Which is to essentially reshape their deeply held beliefs, preferences, or needs. And we do that in a variety of ways effectively. Propaganda is the sort of political version of that. But let me just stick with marketing for a moment, because what has been interesting over the last, I'll call it decade, it's trim around the margins of that, is that you end up with these information silos or bubbles or rabbit holes on political and social issues, and you really don't unstep. You see the basically opposite trends on marketing of products and materials. So like in a period where over the last decade or so, take fashion, but you could do it with cars, you can do it with consumer products. You've actually seen convergence in American tastes There's no longer really coastal fashions as compared to what you see in the middle of America. There's a much shorter gap between sort of expensive fashion brands and mainstream marketed brands. And all of that comes down to marketing approaches that leverage social media characteristics of people, like, where do you live? Are you mom? Are you woman? Are you right? Like all of these characteristics that we also use for political influence, but we use a lot in the US to sell things. And while we've created bubbles in one direction, we basically entirely collapse the market into a uniform look in the other direction. And that comes down to creating targeted marketing that is consistent with an overall brand or look. And so I think where we are now is a question of, there's a lot of opt-in to the bubble approach to marketing. And at some point, there will be a pivot to this broader sort of market appeal. You see a little bit of this. You see it with the Elon Musk new political party that's picked a sort of smattering of issues that actually span political parties, right? So I think, as we talk a lot about the commercial influence on the government and political sphere, we tend to talk about it in terms of policy and people. But there's also these approaches to how do you want to market? How do you want to think about political ideals? And are they like social and political ties, or are they fundamentally productized, to take Erin's word from earlier in the conversation, to a consumer audience that can, pay costs in exchange for those services?
So I'm going to end this part of the conversation here because I just want to call out the fact that in one dialogue, we have basically talked through the Velvet Revolution, the Civil Rights Movement, Hot Girl Summer, fast fashion, and Erica Chenoweth. So I feel like that's
You're
pretty
welcome.
good. That was
Look,
great.
we are really good at staying on brand around here.
Yep.
Okay. So I think it is a good opportunity.
So with that, we're going to close out. This is going to be awesome because we're going to close out with the Gong Show. So I just wanted to share with people that we have a Google Docs document in which we share notes where we talk about various things we want to talk about. And we will actually talk about something, but there's a note here that I'm going to read out loud. Here's an idea. Thoughts on the movie Independence Day, because I thought that could be something that we all have opinions on. Somebody writes next to us, of course I haven't seen this. Sorry. And it has to be Radha, right? It can't be Erin.
No, obviously I've seen Independence Day.
Radha, what were you doing? What were you doing in the 90s?
Reading a book.
Oh, God. Okay, what if... Okay.
Probably about women overcoming adversity.
Maybe we can... I can't do it now. It's too much. But if I could come up with an Independence Day, Pride and Prejudice mashup, maybe we could get there.
Maybe. I mean, I have really enjoyed any movie where they take all of the male characters and just replace them with female leads, and then call a movie. I'm here for it. So saw the Ghostbusters one, saw Oceans, whatever. So,
it's great. Well, I'll just say that Vincent D'Onofrio in Independence Day is just absolutely glorious, absolutely incredible person. Just amazing.
Are there aliens? I should have to Google it to get spoilers. And I was going to offer to read spoilers so that I could participate in
the most important thing is that a
pretend.
Marine saves the day. I mean, we just, go on from there. Let's talk about 4th of July traditions.
And his wife is a stripper.
Oh, also true.
Yep.
Also, who else is always on brand?
Yeah.
And the Marine Corps.
Yeah. All right. 4th of July Day traditions. What are yours, Erin?
Well, I have two that I'll highlight for today. This year, I was in Washington, D.C. for the first time in several years for the 4th of July, which meant I was in town for the 3rd of July. And I have a small but weird habit of hosting 3rd of July parties. Why the 3rd, you ask? Because everyone has the 4th off, even if it's on a Wednesday or a Thursday.
Mm-hmm.
So, everybody always goes someplace, has a big to-do on the 4th. You got to stay up for fireworks and stuff. But the 3rd is open on people's calendars. They've got the next morning to sleep it off. It's a good time. Related, but a little bit distinct, the best drink for a 3rd of July party, also on brand for this podcast, are Costco margaritas.
Yeah,
we will retell the story of the Costco margarita incident sometime. It was really exceptional. It was really quite a situation. I can say that they were a big hit at my 3rd of July party this year, and I encourage everyone to partake.
My tradition I am usually not in town, but when I'm out of town, it involves being in a small town, Minnesota, that has a tiny, tiny, tiny little parade where basically most of the town is in the parade throwing balloons. And there's a guy across the street. He's always blowing up big bubbles. There's a band that plays like 2 songs. There's an egg toss, and it involves a lot of sweating. When I'm in town in DC, I go to the Palisades Parade, which also involves a lot of sweating, but mostly surrounded by very wealthy people. Not that the people in Minnesota aren't wealthy, but just more by contrast. Rada, what about you?
So I will confess to being slightly off brand on this, which is so we usually go on a trip with my husband. So my husband is one of many children and he has a big family, and there are many, my kids thus have many cousins, and they all go to a beach house in North Carolina and we all hang out. That's great. And it is always the 4th of July week. And I really love a good, like, local, slightly dangerous sparkler and or small firework explosive activity, especially when you can provide it to children. Now, I want to be clear, I try to minimize risk, but it's not zero risk. This year, we got our children sparkler swords, which were a real hit. And they're sparklers, but you attach them to swords. And if you just seed boys were frankly sparklers, and you imagine what you would do if you had swords that also were shooting sparks on the end, I'll give you my 4th of July. And I look forward to what I come up with next year in that vein.
I do too.
Incredible.
We bring our first aid kit.
Well, that was a glorious Gong Show conclusion right there, is sparkler swords, sword sparklers, whatever that would be. With that, we close out our 3rd real live episode. Thank you all for listening. We'll see you again.